Good afternoon, everyone. We're going to get started. We're about 6 or 7 minutes late, but that should be no problem. My name is Joan Denton, and I'm the Director of the Office of Environmental Health Hazard Assessment. And this is, I guess, our fourth meeting of the Biomonitoring Science Guidance Panel. It's actually a two-day meeting this afternoon and all day tomorrow. I'd like to start by starting with Gina. Gina, we could just run down the group here, and you could introduce yourselves, the members of the panel. So.
I'm Gina Solomon. I'm a senior scientist at the Natural Resources Defense Council and an associate clinical professor of medicine at UCSF.
Okay, Asa, you got to press the button. You have to press this little green button.
Asa Bradman at the Center for Children's Environmental Health Research at UC Berkeley.
Mike Wilson, research scientist at the Center for Occupational and Environmental Health at UC Berkeley.
Ed Moreno, I'm the health officer for Fresno County and director of the Department of Public Health in Fresno County.
And I'm Dwight Culver, University of California, Irvine, occupational and environmental medicine.
I'm Tom McCone with the School of Public Health at the University of California, Berkeley, and also with the Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory.
Ulrika Luderer, associate professor at the Center for Occupational and Environmental Health, UC Irvine.
Okay, thank you all to the panel members as well as the staff who have prepared this meeting for coming today. This is a two-day meeting, as I mentioned before, and the purpose of today's meeting will be staff will be consulting with the panel on program planning, including laboratory activities. And then tomorrow we'll be talking to the panel and getting your recommendations on potential designated chemicals. Before I turn it over to Dr. Moreno, I wanted to mention just a couple of announcements. The restrooms, if you go out these doors, there are restrooms to the left and there are restrooms to the right. So you can take your choice. If the left is kind of easier to access because they're right over here by the Byron Scher Auditorium. If you go to the right, they're past the elevators, women's to the left, men's to the right. Also, if there should be a fire alarm, we will just exit the room and go down the stairs and exit the front of the building. Just a little bit of background, the last science guidance was held on October 24th, and we held it in two locations over a teleconference, in Oakland and in Irvine, and the focus of that meeting was on statewide sample design options and laboratory activities. So today's meeting will last until 5, although I told Dr. Moreno that we need actually to be out of the room by 5 o'clock. So the meeting is scheduled, though, from 3 to 5. Sarah? Okay, well, then we need to be out of the room by 5:30. Okay, that's good. And then tomorrow the meeting is from 9 to 4, and there are agenda items, handouts in the back of the room. So today's agenda, this afternoon's agenda, which will run from 2 to 5 or 5:30, as I mentioned, involves program planning and laboratory capacity, and Dr. Michael Lipset and Dr. Mirto Petraeus and Dr. Peter Flessel will be carrying on that discussion. And then tomorrow there will be a number of presentations on the potential designated chemicals that will ask us to follow up on. Throughout the meeting, there will be opportunities for the panel to discuss these items with us, as well as the presentations, as well as public comment. Okay, I think that's about it. So I'll turn it over to Dr. Moreno.
All right, thank you, Joan. I want to welcome back our panel members for this meeting and program staff, and also I know there's people from the public, so welcome. And also anyone that's watching on the webcast, welcome. And at this time, I want to briefly go over what some of the goals are for this meeting. Joan's already mentioned a few. In particular, we're going to be looking at or learning more about the biomonitoring program planning activities so far, which include presentations on any issues dealing with resources, and as well as collaboration with other researchers and some presentation discussion on some survey options. We're also looking at laboratory capacity, and we look forward to that presentation today and some discussion. And tomorrow we will get into, or the panel will get into hearing updates on the chemicals that the panel had requested more information on for consideration and making a recommendation to add to the designated list of chemicals. In terms of, after each presentation, our panel will have an opportunity to ask questions of the presenters today, and we'll follow that with public comment. But we will be, following public comment, we will be bringing it back to the panel to have further discussion as necessary based on additional comments provided by the public. The way we're going to handle public comment today is we do have, again, cards available. And if you wish to make some comments, we ask that you please fill out the card, write your name on the card, and what topic you want to comment on. And where can people turn in those cards? Great. Thank you. I ask anyone listening and viewing on the webcast, if you have comments, please email them to biomonitoring@oehha.ca.gov, and those comments will be shared with me, and I'll be able to share those at this meeting. And finally, one request is that the public try to focus the comments to the topic that we're currently discussing. The panel members, you have the materials in your binders for discussion today, and the general public can also access those documents on the website. And we are going to take at least a 10-minute break this afternoon. And we will be finished. We're scheduled to go to 5 o'clock. The latest we can stay is 5:30, and we need to get out of the room by 5:30 today. So that's it. Before we get started, I'm going to ask Ms. Carol Monahan Cummings to make a few comments regarding the public process.
Thank you, Dr. Moreno. Carol Monahan Cummings, Chief Counsel for OEHA and Counsel for this committee. I just want to take just a minute to remind you about the first meeting you had. I mentioned to you that this group is subject to the Bagley-Keene Open Meeting Act, and we provided you all of these materials on the Meeting Act. And I wanted to point out that those are kind of the minimums for ensuring public participation. And so in terms of this group, obviously it's always open to the public, and we have public comments, and you just discussed that. In terms of having subgroups or in the future, I know you've done that already, and that's totally fine. But in future, what I would like to recommend to you is that when you do create subgroups or subcommittees or work groups or whatever, that you consider having those meetings be open to the public as well. I know sometimes the logistics of that are a little bit difficult, but in order to be very transparent and ensure that the public has as much access as possible and input as possible for this program, you should consider having those meetings open as well. Any questions on that? Okay, thank you.
All right, thank you for that clarification. At this time, we're going to go ahead and move forward with the move on with our agenda, and we're going to go ahead and hear from regarding program planning, the resource integration with other researchers and survey options. And at this point, Dr. Michael Lipset will take over the presentations. Dr. Lipset is the chief of the Exposure Assessment Section of the Environmental Health Investigations Branch at the California Department of Public Health. Dr. Lipset.
Thank you, Dr. Moreno, members of the panel. Appreciate this opportunity to provide an update of the program. And could you, the mouse doesn't seem to be, oh, there it goes. Okay, I'm sorry. Okay, as you know from previous meetings, we have been planning for the greater part of the last year to undertake a statewide survey involving 2,000 or more participants over 2-year cycles to participate in the biomonitoring program. This would be modeled after the CDC program, and we've been working pretty closely with the people in the Center for Health Statistics to develop an appropriate sampling strategy. Under direction from the administration, we're planning to incrementally increase the resources to phase in this program over 5 to 6 years, and at the same time to plan to undertake smaller scale community studies. However, given the current fiscal catastrophe here in Sacramento, we need a little bit of a reality check. And I'd alluded to this during our last meeting in October, that we have base level funding for the 3 departments that are listed on this slide, 12 positions total, an ongoing budget of a little over $1 million for our department, $600,000 for OEHA, and about $300,000 for the Department of Toxic Substances Control. Last summer, the legislature department from the general fund to a special fund that's administered by DTSC called the Toxic Substances Control Account, in an attempt to try to is this working okay for you? Okay. In an attempt to try to reduce the burden on the general fund. However, in terms of looking to undertake full program implementation, to do this statewide survey, it's not really going to be feasible given additional funding. And given the current budgetary situation, I think it's unlikely that we're going to be seeing any additional funding soon. Therefore, we're going to need to examine other survey options. Now, our plan B for this was to undertake some smaller scale biomonitoring studies. The initial purchase and installation of laboratory equipment, as mentioned previously, will be done early in 2009, and we will be able to use this to collaborate with researchers and possibly in the future to undertake some targeted community studies. In terms of the collaborations, we distributed a request for information for researchers throughout California to submit an application to have some samples that they had previously archived to be analyzed by the laboratories in this program. And we discussed this briefly at the last meeting. At that time, we had received no applications. However, since then, we have received a number. But the idea was to not only to undertake some biomonitoring that would be useful to further the goals of this program, but to add value to some of these existing epidemiologic or exposure assessment studies. And to be able to explore the feasibility laboratories of analyzing certain chemicals on a larger scale. The idea was to be able to analyze these data, to generate them, to be made public in 2010. So since the last meeting, we received 10 different project descriptions or applications from 6 different research institutions. Unfortunately, there were limited supplemental funding that was indicated that these researchers would have available to support these analyses. We received 8 responses indicating that the researchers had previously archived samples of blood and urine to analyze, and 2 in which these blood and urine samples will be collected at some point in the future. The analytes that the researchers had requested that they look at are listed on this table. These are all within will be within the capabilities of the laboratories to analyze during 2000. You'll hear more about that from Drs. Petraeus and Flessel in the next presentation. Now, we're in the process now of evaluating these responses to the RFI using these criteria that the analytes fit within the lab capabilities, and as I indicate, that is I think all of these have met that, that the samples were appropriately collected and not contaminated, and there were adequate specimen volumes to do the analysis that were requested, that these are populations of interest in California, they're recent samples, and finally that there be some funding to support these additional lab analyses. Now, at the last meeting, I think Dr. Bradman had asked specifically whether in responses that were submitted to this RFI, whether this was a necessity to have this funding. And at that point, we weren't sure of what the budgetary situation, and even though at this point we're still not sure, it looks much more dire than at the last meeting. So that this last criterion has taken on a much more important status within the hierarchy of these criteria we're going to be evaluating these by. So the current status of this review, we're going to be requesting a little bit of clarification from a couple of the responders with respect to issues that we were not, well, we needed some additional clarification from some of the responses. This is going to take place within the next few weeks. We'll make a selection among these in early January and contact the people who submitted these applications shortly thereafter. And we hope to begin the analyses in spring of 2009. Any panel members have any questions about the RFI at this point? Okay, I'll proceed. Okay, the other thing that we're actively discussing, starting to plan for at this point, is to undertake some community studies. And I wanted to review briefly for you what community means under the legislation that set up this program. That it refers not only to geographic communities, but to non-geographically based populations that may share common exposures because of similar occupations, or these may be populations that have a common health outcome that may be linked to chemical exposures, or experience similar exposures because of consumption, lifestyle, product use, or shared ethnicity, age, or gender. Now, one of the things that we haven't really discussed with the panel is that the CDC has committed to us to undertake 2 sets of analyses of chemicals under a memorandum of understanding with the laboratories. One is to analyze up to 10 chemical groups of samples from 500 subjects. The other analyze a single chemicals in samples from 200 participants. And for an initial type of community study, we were hoping to try to leverage this offer of CDC analytical assistance. And on this slide, presented some examples of the kinds of community types of studies that we could potentially undertake. We could collaborate with a clinic, say with a university OBGYN clinic, say to obtain paired maternal child or maternal cord blood specimens. We could look at one or more occupational groups who have exposures that encompass the CECBC priority chemicals, such as firefighters, nail salon workers, people who work with flame retardants, such as furniture foam workers. We could undertake a study of a specific geographic area, say near heavy traffic or a special source, or choose a health-affected group. Now, the specific sampling design, including the questionnaires that we would develop, would really depend on what this community is. And part of that really depends on what are the chemicals that are going to be priority chemicals. So this whole chemical selection process that you've been engaging in for the past few meetings is really an important milestone to get through in terms of having not only a universe of designated chemicals, but priority chemicals, because that will really help determine what kind of community study or which group we're going to be investigating. Now, both the design and the field operations protocols that where we would collect the specimens and send them to CDC, this does take time to prepare, and also we're going to need to get additional resources to develop these. Other ancillary of activities that we plan to undertake that will help not only with the community studies, but with the full program implementation at a later date, is to partner with researchers to try to develop, say, best practices for results communication. And, as you know, this is a real issue if we return results to individuals without being able to tell them what these things may mean clinically, for example, that this is this is an area that is really novel. There's almost no literature on it. There's almost no research, and this is something where we would actively like to partner with academicians and others who are researching this to try and identify what are the most appropriate methods for results communication. We also would like to undertake some capacity building activities, say via some public conversations or discussions with members of the healthcare providers to help increase the awareness and understanding about biomonitoring. Again, these are going to require external resources. So what we were hoping to get some input from you on at this point is a discussion really on the kinds of studies that you think would be most appropriate for us to think about undertaking, whether these would be descriptive exposure assessment types of studies or maybe hypothesis-driven research studies, maybe to discuss the pros and cons of specific types of studies, and then also something on results communication. I'd mentioned that these other activities are going to require external funding. We have met with one of the large California foundations that has expressed an interest potentially in funding some of these activities, but we would need to really get very specific about the design and costing out of one or more of these in order to be able to form a proposal to that foundation or to any others. So any input or discussion that you have on these topics, we would really appreciate. Thank you.
All right. I want to bring it back to the panel and ask the panel to, if they have any questions.
Sure. Michael, could you just talk a little bit more about the first bullet on collaborating with clinics to obtain maternal-child biospecimens? What those biospecimens might be, and the number that the actual number of samples you're considering, and so forth.
Well, if we were to try to focus exclusively on that as a community study, I mean, one example of that might be to say collaborate with medical school. For us, in terms of the ease of doing that, it would probably be UCSF to say get maternal and then cord samples, paired samples, to try to look at what kinds of levels of specific chemicals you might identify in each of these. And one might put down specific eligibility criteria, say that for different racial or ethnic groups, say from also different geographic criteria, say from San Francisco or the Peninsula, Marin, where you would be able to encompass as well a lot of economic variability too. And one could try to have this represent a kind of exposure type of study. You know, one aspect that might be very useful for something like this would be that it could help feed into the whole green chemistry initiative, for example, where we'd be able to identify, you know, not only what adults are exposed to, but what infants are being born with. One would assume, depending on what those are, if they're bioaccumulative, that these might become chemicals of concern for the green chemistry process. But at the number, back to the number. If the CDC is willing to do 500 samples, we would probably get 250 paired samples.
Okay. Go ahead.
Okay. Joan has a question, and then Dr. McCone.
Michael, we talked about bringing visibility to the program, given the resource constraints. That it would be good to get some products out, some results out, that demonstrable results of the program, say coming up this next year, to give some visibility that this is a program that's producing something, and that would, be maybe more amenable to our pleas for resources. Are there any aspects or any of these, any particular, from this list, do you see that there's more potential in that arena, in any particular ones of this laundry list of studies, that we get results out earlier and maybe bring visibility to the program?
I think all of them are going to take some time to design the study, and I think in terms of having really early results, that would be more likely to be done with the bank samples that the labs are going to analyze for the responders to the RFI. I think to undertake any of these, we would need to design it, go to one or more foundations to try and get some support for it, and then go out into the field. We're probably not looking at results from any of these really till, I don't want to make any concrete predictions, but probably towards the end of 2010 or early 2011, something like that, for any of them.
Even the banked samples?
No, bank samples for the RFI, the labs are going to be talking about that later today. That should be early next year. I mean, they're going to start early next year, and that would be available in early 2010.
Dr. McCone had a question.
And, I'm just trying to clarify if I understand it. It sounds like, of course, in an ideal world with the original plan was to really have a probabilistic sample of the state organized the way CDC would do it, but the ideal world is not there,
right,
because of finance. So what we're trying to do is take opportunities and other studies that can be used. My question is, have you spent some time thinking about, I mean, this is not going to be quite what we originally talked about doing, which was a really nice probabilistic sample, but in some ways this may fill in, it may fill in a lot of the pieces of that. It may actually work almost as well in some cases. Have you thought about how to take, instead of what you want to do, but what we have an opportunity to do, and make it fit as much into the plan so that it's still quite useful in terms of the concept that was originally developed? Does that make sense? I mean, have you spent some time thinking about would there be really big gaps, or maybe some gaps that would accrue from this sort of approach?
Well, if I understand you correctly, in terms of the fitting back into the concept, you're talking about having a more representative statewide type of sample?
Right. I mean, we're not going to have that, but is there some way to, in other words, it's not what we want, it's kind of what we can get. But can we make what we can get into what we really wanted by some, statistical hard work or something like that?
Yeah. Well, I've listed here a number of examples of the kinds of studies that could be done. There are some other possibilities too. I mean, there is a maternal alpha fetoprotein specimen bank that contains hundreds of thousands of samples from women statewide, but the sample volumes are very small. I mean, it may be possible to select a certain number from that. It's clearly limited to pregnant women, which obviously that would be a group that would be of interest to the program and presumably to policymakers. But it would be a potentially more limited number of analytes that one could look at in those samples, at least initially. With for our laboratories, because the sample volume is so small. I mean, just a couple of ml. But that might be another possibility of a kind of study that we could undertake as well, and might meet more of the kinds of criteria that you're thinking about. I mean, does that answer your question, or?
I think it does. I mean, I'm also sort of probing a bit to see, I mean, for me, and I think for some of the committee, we would like as much as possible to make sure we're making progress on the original goal, even though we can't do it exactly that way. And I think, maybe one of the things that needs to be done is not only looking at the opportunities, but also some sort of value of information for what you have and how that relates to a more ideal situation. And I'm not sure I haven't really formulated this, but I think it might somewhat be a sort of a simulation exercise that someone could go through to see, well, how likely is it that you would capture a truly probabilistic sample if you didn't do it that way, but instead took an opportunity sample. I mean, that's sort of where I'm I'm thinking. And it might be a useful exercise to go through. Not very expensive to do that, because that the sort of the simulation exercise is sitting around sort of working out some way to ask, and we'd probably need a biostatistician or someone to work on that who's thought through these sorts of things.
Okay. Well, we don't have that kind of statistical resource, but possibly OEHA does. I mean, Lauren, do you want to address that?
We do have those still, the contract with CDC, and that's going to run for at least another year. And they have offered us continuous statistical input and consultation. So it's possible we could direct our contract resources with them to help design a community-based type study, again, using a probabilistic method.
Yeah, it might be. I mean, if that doesn't cost a lot, I mean, it might enhance the value of information that's derived from these, moving them toward our goal of having a more probabilistic.
Yeah, you know, I think it might be useful for us to talk with you about more specifically what you're thinking of, because in terms of utilizing the resources from CDC, we were going to have them help us with some additional planning, say if we wanted to do a small area study, a real geographic community study, to take some of the principles that have been at the last meeting by Dr. Curtin and try and involve that. So before committing any CDC resources to undertaking this additional exercise, I think we need to be really clear on what it is that you think, what it is that you think would be the outcome of this kind of analysis and how that would help in the decision-making process.
I mean, you want to do that more offline, or you want to make that part of our discussion?
Well, it's up to you. I mean, I think in terms of I mean, if you, I think it'd probably be better to do offline.
You know, without getting technical, I mean, just sort of thinking of some of the Bayesian methodology where you can develop, you know, a prior, and then you can, when you target samples and then say how likely is it that I would see what I sampled in a small subsample, given that the bigger subsample has this characteristic. So, I mean, that's sort of what I'm thinking, some Bayesian and Bayesian Monte Carlo, which has been used in other fields when you only do a little bit of surveillance and you want to put the surveillance in the context of what you think is happening in the actually, if you want to see a great example of this, you just look at all the analysis of the elections that went on and how people could take certain trends and you know, could take early trends in exit polls and then turn it into a national pattern. So it's sort of it's an inverse modeling, but it's not anything innovative. I don't think it's not something that we would have to, if we found the right people who know how to do this, they could say how likely it is that a small community sample actually could represent a bigger picture of the state.
What I'd like to suggest, perhaps, because I think, I mean, we have been also just pondering the possibility of trying to get at some of the goals of the statewide sampling with alternative means, and I think it would be useful to try to explore this issue a bit further. And we could also explore it with OEHA if there's not sufficient funding in the CDC, and also maybe with some academic partners. So I'd like to suggest that we come back, we look at this issue and come back to it.
Yeah, well, I think we can continue the discussion offline. Okay, thanks.
Could I, okay. Oh, I'd like to actually follow that.
Yeah, Dr. Wilson, you had some more comments.
Sure, and I guess I think it's relevant to your question here about sort of input on options for the community studies, in that looking at this this set of options, that one of the questions that comes to mind is there any one of these that would be most useful in terms of its generalizability? And I think that sort of gets to Tom's point, that, and if that's our objective, then the way we set up the sampling criteria is important, of course. And you'd mentioned, for example, in the first one around the maternal child biospecimens, that there might be a set of criteria, inclusion criteria for the participants. And I think what I hear Tom saying is rather than that, maybe it makes sense to design a sample that would be a random sample that would perhaps be more generalizable. And so I guess my question then is if, and more useful, as you're saying, to the larger objective. And so I guess the question is, I know in our last session we really grappled with the biostatistics issues and the representativeness of the samples, but I guess if we were to obtain 250 matched samples of maternal-child biospecimens, does that give us the power, if we were to do it in a random way, to make a statement about that could be generalized? Do we have the statistical power within 250 matched samples to in fact say anything? Do we know that yet?
Well, I guess it would. We haven't done those kinds of power calculations.
Yeah.
But my guess is with those numbers, depending on what the chemicals are, what their concentrations were, what the coefficient of variability is in terms of the lab methods. I mean, all these things would need to be factored into it.
Right.
But we might end up with, somewhat wide confidence intervals.
Right.
But if it's done in an appropriately, randomized, probabilistic type of way within that target population,
right,
we probably would be able to make some reasonable generalizations.
Right.
Yeah.
So it seems as well. I would concur. I think that might be more valuable, actually.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Dr. Solomon has a question, but if I could just get some clarification before Dr. Solomon asks. So in your presentation, what you presented was that there's the R5s, and you're looking at, from what I understand, looking at participating with researchers who already have bank samples, correct? That was one of the options. Okay. And if we do that, could you explain to me what the considerations are for that that group of samples that we'd be testing in terms of how they were, the selection process that researcher used to identify those participants and collect those samples, and how that prior criteria that were used would be taken into consideration in trying to analyze them for the purposes of a small study for the biomonitoring program.
So are you asking in terms of whether the bank samples were collected from people who were recruited in a way that might be representative of the population of the state of California?
Do you have information? Have you had a chance to look at that and come to some I guess conclusions as to how the selection criteria would impact the ability to use that for the purposes of the biomonitoring program? Because what I'm thinking is if it was randomized representation of the population, be it pregnant women or whoever, if that is close enough to the criteria that the biomonitoring program would be using in the future,
mm-hmm.
then could that be useful in the future? We can make some presumptive, not presumptive, but some early findings based on with the limited resources we have, and then as we go to funding is available and we start expanding the biomonitoring program, we could include that group that we studied in 2009 into a larger group. Is that possible?
Yeah, well, without getting into the specifics of each one of these the application seed, can say that a number of the populations that from whom these samples were obtained were not recruited in that way. I mean, you could say something about that kind of population and who they might represent within the state of California, but they're not necessarily generalizable to the population as a whole.
Okay, thanks. Dr. Solomon?
Yes, I heard two things really in that presentation. One is that we're very short on money, and the other is that we're pretty short on time. Mm-hmm. If we're hoping to get any kind of results by the end of 2010, optimistically, that we really would have to, correct me if I'm wrong, sort of go with one of these strategies and really try to push forward fairly quickly. And so what that tells me is that that maybe our role could best be to help sort of try to figure out what, without complicating things too much, which of these alternatives, or if there's another alternative that isn't here in front of us, might meet the criteria for being, relatively inexpensive, relatively efficient, especially in terms of participant recruitment, because looking at the bulleted alternatives here, I think some of them would be more complicated in terms of recruitment than others. And I think some of the alternatives that were proposed, random sampling strategies might even be yet more complicated in terms of recruitment. So, if we think about that and try to weigh those concerns against, it's obviously the desire to have a representative sample ultimately, frankly, I'm not sure if we should be striving for representativeness yet. I feel like we should be striving for something that's doable. So it's just my observation. I also have a question or just clarification on the chemical list. Since my understanding is CDC will be doing these analyses, so does that mean that in terms of the analytes, we would be looking only at the CDC list of chemicals and not considering anything that, for example, the panel might be designating over the coming day or in the future?
Well, I think given what their offer is, we ought to take them up on doing 10, not just 10 chemicals, but 10 particular chemical groups. But in terms of going forward with the process that was envisioned with the legislation, it would be good to have specific priority chemicals that you would have recommended to us, that we would have identified as being really important for California, to be, and to make sure whatever the CDC analyzes that the bulk of them, the bulk or all of our priority chemicals be encompassed in that list, although we know that there may be some that they may not be able to do.
So just in follow-up, does that mean that it would be helpful for us to identify priority chemicals in the course of this meeting?
I don't think that that's, I've talked about this with some of the other staff, and I think that because that particular decision was not noticed, and Carol, maybe you want to comment on this. Is this something that they could proceed with in terms of designating priority chemicals or not? I was under the impression that it was designated chemicals only at this meeting.
I'm not sure I understand the question. I'm sorry.
The question was whether the panel could go beyond adding to the list of designated chemicals and could actually recommend priority chemicals.
Tomorrow or today, or
during the course of this meeting?
I would recommend against that, just because it isn't on the agenda. So it's probably better for you not to do that. One thing to keep in mind, though, is you're providing advice, and it's not a binding decision of the group. And so if you wanted to provide some advice about, we think that we're looking at X chemical as a priority for. We want to discuss that at the next meeting or something, you could do that, but I wouldn't recommend doing anything that's outside the agenda. It's not worth the trouble that can be caused. So.
Dr. Solomon, anything else? Okay.
George Alexia. I just had a couple clarifying questions, and maybe, I hope I'm not the only one confused, but maybe you could clarify this, because Dr. Wilson was talking about the number of samples, and so there's a couple things I just wanted to clarify. With regard to the RFI goals, does the sampling that you're envisioning in that, does that influence anything with regards to the other options in terms of workload or choices or things like that? Are these you're envisioning that both things are doable. That's what I'm asking.
Well, with respect to the RFI, the workload on that is mainly at the laboratories, at DTSC and the CDPH laboratories. With respect to designing the community study, for example, that will be something that would be mainly the Environmental Health Investigations Branch staff and people from OEHA with some input from DTSC as well. So there may be some overlap of time from some of the laboratory staff, but the bulk of that work would be done by non-laboratory people.
So, okay, that's one thing I wanted to clarify. And then with regards to what Dr. Wilson said about the number of samples, so because I was looking in the actual overhead, and it talks about 500 samples, and you referred to 250 paired samples. So I just wanted to clarify that. Am I mixing?
That's 250, one from a mother, one from a child.
Okay.
So times 2 would give you 500.
All right. So, but that is actually listed under the community study, correct?
Right. As an initial attempt to leverage the CDC's offer of assistance to provide this laboratory assistance, because our laboratories will, they're still installing the equipment. They're going to be working on analyzing materials from the response to the RFI. They're going to be developing new methods, and by the time we go out and actually collect samples from people with any one of these particular options, presumably the laboratories will be done with much of the work in response to the RFI, and will be able to do, they would not be doing the analysis for this, but they may be able to undertake some additional analyses, say of priority chemicals, for example, that the CDC would not be doing for us.
Okay. I want to give Dr. Litter an opportunity to ask a question, but before that, we're going to be taking public comment in a few minutes, so I want to remind everyone to fill out the cards, and if staff could bring the cards up. Thank you. Dr. Litter?
Hi. So I wanted to ask a question having to do, addressing this issue that some of the other panel members have also brought up about, how might possible, to leverage some of these other types of collaborative options in order to still address that goal of having a population-based sample, of the state of California, which is kind of the original goal of the legislation. And I've wondered whether you've explored any possibilities to maybe collaborate with studies that are population-based studies that already include a large population within California, so that it's a population-based sample. And I mean, the thing that comes to my mind initially would be something like the National Children's Study, which has not yet started but is about to. And there are many sites within the state of California where they will, be recruiting population-based sample of California women, some prior to conception, some after conception, and obtaining lots of biospecimens, whether there might be some way of collaborating with that study, in a way that enables maybe, analyses to be done that might not be able to be done as, and to also, kind of analogous to what you're doing with the CDC, where the CDC NHANES program is enabling you to maybe do some analyses that you wouldn't have the funding to do otherwise, kind of on the other side of this, collaborating to have access potentially to a population that's a probabilistic sample within the state of California. It's just an idea.
So the idea would be then to try to piggyback on something like the National Children's Study. And this is something that I'm certainly willing to explore. I know a number of the investigators in California. And there may be some room in terms of what their flexibility might be, but to the extent that we say if we want to develop exposure-specific questions for specific chemicals, which is one of the things that we wanted to do, that may or may not fit into the protocol that they want to undertake, and or if all we would want to do would be to obtain an extra couple of tubes of blood, well, that problem as well with children. So, but it's something that I think is worth talking to some of these investigators, and I'm certainly willing to do that.
I can comment a little bit on that too. I'm actually PI of Kern County for the National Children's Study, and the protocol is very prescribed, and there is a process to develop ancillary studies. They have to fit in with the goals of the NCS, but there is a process, and it might be possible to do something. The next steps would be to talk with some of the center directors in California, like Jim Swanson, Irva Hertz, and Neil Haflon. But again, the protocol is very prescribed, and making change to it is not easy. However, there could be opportunities to use that infrastructure to recruit other kinds of participants. I wanted to step back, though, and get back to some of the requests for kind of input here, and looking at this list of possible community studies. I look at that and say, they're all important, and these are all areas that need more attention and should get more attention. I think it would be wisest, though, to do community-based studies that are meaningful to the larger population. And I wouldn't want to, I hate the idea of excluding, for example, certain kinds of occupational studies. But I think if we were to focus, for example, on children and mothers, that's a sample that's a population that is really a strong, is strongly connected to the well-being of our society. And that generating more information on that and coming from the state, I think is a strong statement and commitment of the state to try to understand what are the health risks and what are the exposures that are going on in that population. And if you were to choose other strategies, again, I would think looking at populations that again, generating information that's meaningful to the whole population. On the question here about descriptive or hypothesis-driven studies, I would actually focus on the descriptive, and maybe there's some other people have different opinions here. I think the danger of focusing on hypothesis-driven research is if through your question, you're kind of left with a null finding. Whereas with descriptive research, you're really categorizing what people are exposed to and developing some sort of health interpretation. And it would be, I think it would be a challenge or create, certain possibly policy issues if you're doing research that is potentially related to public policy decisions and the results are null, or they're null because the design wasn't quite right, and you kind of open up a whole can of worms that I think could be raise challenges for the programs. And then the last thing where I had some thoughts that we haven't really touched on is the whole issue about communicating results. And there is a small literature on that, and there are some people here in the Bay Area I'm sure would be happy to describe what they've gone through. I'm sure I'd be happy to describe what we've gone through with returning results back now to about half of all our participants on pesticide results in children. And in my experience, it's not difficult and it's not complicated. I know there's been a lot of ethical issues. We had to fight with our IRB to actually have permission to return results. However, after going through a relatively simple process and sitting down with people, doing it in person, explaining what they mean, or if you're not doing it in person, have a venue for responding personally to individual results. It's kind of a moot issue. People want to know. People don't freak out, and it overall tends to be a positive experience. So.
Okay. Well, Dr. Bradman, I think we might want to subcontract with you for that process. Because I've read most of the published literature on this, and it is an area that where there haven't been a lot of people who've done what you've been able to do. I mean, it's just been undertaken, and I guess one of the concerns that we've had is just in trying to communicate information, especially say involving children. And I'm actually quite impressed to hear that you've had that level of success. I'd say with some of the PBTs that you find in high levels in kids, where you have some toxicology that suggests that there may be potentially significant issues with later on for these kids, and being able to do that in such a way as to not generate undue anxiety in the parents is, I think it's, well, I'm going to defer to your experience on it, but it would seem to me to be a priori something that's not really that straightforward.
Well, there's discussion we can have about that. I don't know if we want to have it now, but I mean, I think there are specific steps you can take in terms of offering retesting and follow up, and that tends to assuage people's concerns. Also, if they understand that the testing is being done in a research context, because many of the things we're testing for are not, there's no clinical definition of what they mean. You know, and of course lead, few others have exceptions, but in general, but again, I think that's another discussion.
Okay. Well, thank you. Could I ask the other panel members actually to reflect back on what Dr. Bradman said about hypothesis-driven versus exposure assessment type of research?
Why don't we start on this side and we'll work our way down with comments. Go ahead.
Yeah, I had made notes almost to the same effect that and a little bit different reasoning, I guess, but I thought if you start doing the hypothesis-driven studies, it takes away from the sort of uniqueness of this program. It starts looking like another health study, and I think there may be a danger to doing that. But also I agree with Ace's point too, is that if it's a hypothesis-driven study, it'll move in a certain direction, and the more we can keep it descriptive, I think the more it feeds into our original intent of having a representative of the state of California. So I would probably second that point.
I would. Ed?
Anyone else?
Susan down there.
No, go ahead.
I would concur with that particularly at this point in the development of the program, that a descriptive study opens the possibility of further questions and inquiry, whereas in a hypothesis-driven one, it tends to give us an answer that's can be fairly constrained. And so I would also support this, a descriptive approach. And also, in just looking at the set of options here, I think what's interesting, what I hear on the panel here is sort of a back and forth on the matters of recruitment, expense, and efficiency, sort of balanced against what is going to be most valuable with respect to public health and public health information. And I think I would concur with Asa that looking at the question of maternal child biospecimens, that as an option probably addresses all of those criteria in terms of ease of recruitment, expense, efficiency, and broad value. My experience in gathering occupational health samples, for example, extremely difficult to do. Number one, in a non-unionized workforce, in that your access to those workers hinges on the employer's consent. Really, in a non-unionized, facility or workforce, and with a unionized workforce, you have more options, but again, and there's more access in that you have some independence there. But again, it's difficult to say much about that for the general population, right? It's going to be specific for that occupational setting or that population of workers. And as valuable as that is, as valuable as it is, but I think in terms of public health value, a maternal child biospecimen is probably higher, gives us more information. The other is that on the health affected group approach, again, definitely worth doing, but I worry about how the findings are communicated, and that if it was autism or breast cancer affected participants, that these were the inclusion criteria, we then collected these samples. It's not possible for us to really say that there's any real linkage there, at this point. And so in terms of the risk communication, I think we need to think about where we're headed with that. And so my instinct is to sort of that's probably not a good approach, to look at health affected groups. And again, back to your first option.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
I had the same response when I saw the list, particularly that it included breast cancer, where there has been a significant lack of success in surveying breast cancer-affected women for chemicals of interest, and where we think that where the latency is a big issue and maybe decades, where time of exposure and dose of exposure and multiple exposures may all play a role, which are things you are not going to be able to address in a small community study. I think the risk of coming up with something that only upsets people and disable is high, whereas a more observational study allows you to have absolute results. We set out to observe something. We observed things. Here's what we observed. Now, what you can do with it is sort of the next step. And here are the questions that these raise that then allow themselves to are subject for future research studies. Mm-hmm. Is I think the way to go, and especially if you want something that is quick, as Gina was just talking about. If we want something that where we have you have absolutely can deliver something that's of interest to people in a short period of time, I think what you can do is observations.
And I fully concur with my colleagues on the committee, both about focusing on descriptive as opposed to hypothesis-driven studies at this point, and the appeal of the maternal-child biospecimen approach, certainly among the options here as a good way to go for the reasons people have outlined.
All right, so I think you're hearing consensus on the question you asked the panel. I'm interested in something that this panel and the program can publish and put forth, and to raise interest, to demonstrate that this is a good product. We need more of this. We need more funding. This could be bigger and better, and we're going to get more of this when the funding is available. So, so you got the answer you're looking for on that one?
I got the discussion I was looking for. Yeah. Thank you. This is very helpful.
Okay.
Very helpful.
If you don't mind, we are a little over our schedule. We were at this time. We're going to open up to public comment, and I have one request to speak from Davis Baltz.
Thank you very much for the opportunity to speak today, members of the panel. I'm Davis Baltz with Commonweal, nonprofit in Bolinas, California, and with Breast Cancer Fund, we were co-sponsors of the legislation that created this program. Now, as has been said, the statute calls for both a statewide representative sample and community studies. So, we don't have the money right now to do the statewide representative sample, and I think we're all clear on that. But it's not going to be a setback for the program to go ahead and do the community studies. So let's not look at this as sort of the second choice. Of course, we want to scale up and do these regular statewide studies, but in the interest of generating some data and some interest in the program, it is important to move forward. I have also heard the talk about the maternal-child pairs, and I think reasons that have been discussed already that would be a good choice, especially since we have this offer from CDC to provide the analysis. But as Gina pointed out, there's time is of the essence here too, and I don't know if this would pass muster with any of you, but if we want to generate some discussion in California about what these results might mean and what it can mean for Californians, why don't we offer the lab capacity here in this state in a pilot to test every member of the legislature? Not all of them will take us up on the offer, but I guarantee you we will get some prominent media attention and discussion, and I think that could translate into some support financially. Another idea that I've floated before is, absent that, or maybe in addition to, let's offer a biomonitoring test to county health officers. This way, county is represented, And if we also get a good sampling of the legislature, I think you could say that this would be a representative sample of California. Now, concerning the funding, Commonweal has actually gotten a grant recently to do some public education around biomonitoring, and we've been doing that since this legislation was passed. But we have some more targeted money, and as I've said to you before, we're committed to helping raise the profile of this program and help it develop. If there's some way that we can approach some foundations as well and take on some piece of this that would be helpful, we're ready to do that. And one thing that comes to my mind is, a year or two ago at Boston University, there was a consensus process on biomonitoring. It's a model that I think is commonly done in Europe, where a cross-section of people who don't necessarily have technical background in an area are brought together in an intensive period of discussion with presentations to learn about an issue, and then come forward with those sort of lay findings that reflect sort of society's interest. And I think if we could combine some limited community study with this process that would inform how we can communicate results and again raise the profile of the program, this could be a kind of an interesting thing for a foundation to fund, especially if it was a partnership with communities, the government program, and maybe some accommodations as well. The last thing I'll say is Dr. Lipset mentioned the Green Chemistry Initiative, and I think it's worth starting to look at the biomonitoring program as a component of green chemistry. Certainly, we know there's a bit of momentum right now in California for green chemistry, despite our budgetary problems. The fact that DTSC has been the driver for the Green Chemistry Initiative, Gorson has been a champion of it, and the laboratory at DTSC is involved in this program. I think we need to make a better effort to convince all the parties that biomonitoring, in fact, does advance green chemistry. We're going to have the implementation this year of AB 1879 and SB 509, sort of the first planks in the green chemistry platform, if you will. And we don't have the official report yet on what the Green Chemistry Initiative is ultimately going to encompass. But from the point of view of someone who works in the nonprofit sector, I think any green chemistry initiative that ultimately will be supported will need to retire some bad actor chemicals. And there are a number out there that we certainly have enough information on to act. So if we can fold in biomonitoring results into this process of the development of the green chemistry, I think it would be worth doing, and maybe would smooth out some of the potential hurdles we face of this cross-agency collaboration, especially in light of funding for the program going to the TSCA account at DTSC. So thanks as always for the chance to comment.
Thank you. Any questions from panel members for Mr. Baltz? Yes, we do.
Davis? I appreciate the your mention of the Green Chemistry Initiative. I think I concur with that one of the challenges under AB 1879 is going to be to identify and prioritize chemicals of concern and without getting paralyzed. And I concur. I think this is an interesting lens, the state's biomonitoring program, as a way for the state to move quickly and to identify substances that are relevant in California and so forth. So I appreciate that comment. I'm wondering if you could just comment a little bit more about the program at Boston University.
What they did was they identified, I think, about a dozen, I can't remember the exact number, but it was probably not more than a dozen, citizens in greater Boston who expressed an interest to participate, but basically didn't know much about biomonitoring. And so they came together over more or less a year-long process, and they gathered on 2 or 3 weekends and heard presentations from experts on biomonitoring, both the laboratory side, communication and results side, sort of, the kind of experts that you are sitting on this panel. And then with some skilled facilitation, they developed report on their findings, basically, on biomonitoring, what they felt its value to society would be, and recommendations for policymakers for how they should move forward with advancing biomonitoring.
Right. Thank you.
Okay, other comments, questions? Yes, Dr. Solomon.
I think the suggestion to biomonitor some high-profile people, I don't know if it should be legislators or who, but is a provocative one. And if the lab is actually going to be opening, so to speak, in early 2009, it does seem like a good opportunity to have an official lab opening event and to potentially invite some folks to tour the lab, and there will be a need to collect some samples at that point from some volunteers. So I'd like to suggest that we, to staff, that you think about what sort of falls within the bounds of what is doable in terms of a lab opening event, and that we would certainly, as panelists, those panelists who are located nearby, I think, would be very happy to come participate in any such event if it were held.
Throughout the time the legislation was, before it was enacted, we stressed in all the committee hearings that we felt it was very important for the biomonitoring program to be science-based, and that should be the priority, so that any results couldn't be attacked for being sloppy, and we continue to agree with that. And I don't think there's necessarily a contradiction between having a lab opening event with a little media attached and still have a very rigorous science analysis, despite the fact that the people who may be in the study aren't going to be the representative sample that ideally that we would like. We've been talking with a number of communities about biomonitoring, and a number of them have expressed interest in sort of stepping forward and volunteering to be biomonitored if this could be something that the program would be interested in. Again, not necessarily representative of California in a statistical sense, but a number of different communities whose constituencies are affected by chemical exposure, and then could be spokespeople for generating public support, which then could come back up through their legislative representatives.
Okay, any other questions? Thank you. Dr. Lipset, I just want to go over, before we break, what I understand that we covered in this portion of the meeting. The current status of the review is that additional information will be requested of the responders, and that selection will take place in January of 2009. Is that correct? Which means this panel will be expecting additional information as a result of that work at the next meeting, or after this meeting.
Okay.
Excuse me, Dr. Moreno. And it's closed. I'd like to report that there is a comment being submitted by Rebecca Sutton from the Environmental Working Group, who indicates the Environmental Working Group supports the idea of maternal-child sample pairings as part of the California Biomonitoring Program. Thanks for the opportunity to attend the conference via webcast.
Thank you. And that'll be added to the record. Thank you.
The answer is yes. We can provide that information at the next panel meeting, or we could also, Carol, if it's okay to mail the panel members, or would it be something that we may need? Actually, I think we'll do it at the next meeting.
Can we receive that information in compliance with the Bagley-Keene Act, however that is most appropriate, and staff can determine? Yes, thank you. All right. And did you also get sufficient input from the panel on the community studies and ancillary activities?
Yeah, I think that Yeah, I think this is a very helpful discussion, and actually, I'd like to ask Dr. McCone again regarding your earlier suggestion about looking at these different types of studies with respect to the kinds of information that would be generated that could be applied to the, say, initial conceptualization of the program in terms of a representative sample. Do you still feel that you'd want to undertake this kind of simulation exercise, given the kinds of feedback you've heard from the rest of the panel?
I think there was a consensus that, I mean, I was really speaking to the issue of making it generalizable, so to some extent we could take the community sampling and have it to determine to what extent it gives us insight about the broader representativeness of the state population. I still think that's feasible with them. It's just sort of a standard inverse modeling problem. I know it's not standard for a lot of people, but I don't think it's that. I mean, it's something we should look at.
Okay.
Because it might actually enhance the value of limited information.
Great. Okay. Thank you.
All right. Thank you. So with this, I think we're going to take a 10-minute break. So it's. All right, I'd like to call the meeting back to order. If the public could have a seat, and our panel members come back to the dais. Thank you.
Oh. Do you think it'd be useful to have Michael reiterate the question?
I think so. I think we need.
Okay. Well, welcome back, everyone. I'm just going to regress just for a moment to our prior presenters, just for a second. Dr. Lipset, there's some interest, I believe, from some panel members for a brief reminder of the statute that enacted this program and the intent. Remind us what we're trying to achieve as we continue with these discussions today.
Well, in looking at the statute, in both the preamble and what's contained in the bill, it was intended to set up a biomonitoring program for California that had a number of components. One of was to undertake a statewide representative sample to try and set a baseline level of specific chemicals that we would identify within that population. The participants would be allowed to have their results upon request. This is another aspect of it, that there be meaningful opportunities for public participation, that there be technical input from a scientific guidance panel, and that within the statewide survey, in addition to trying to set a baseline level of specific chemicals, that we would look for trends over time that could be used to help us assess regulatory and other kinds of public health interventions to reduce exposures over time. And then in addition, the bill called for community studies as well, contingent upon funding. And does that cover it, or would you like additional? I'm not looking directly at the bill, but I certainly could provide more if you'd like additional information.
Michael, I think Dr. Culver's is what question is the biomonitoring program seeking to answer? What question? What are the levels of chemicals in Californians on a statewide basis as well as a community? I mean, what is the kind of what is the question or questions that the program is seeking to answer?
Okay. Well, there are a number of uses to which biomonitoring data could be put, and that are spelled out in the preamble of to the legislation. But the main question is, what is it that people are exposed to? What is it that people actually have within their body, within their blood and urine, and their tissues? Because as is indicated in the manual itself, there are like nearly 100,000 chemicals that are in use, registered for use in this country, for which we have very, very little information in terms of their potential health effects, and we have even less information about the exposure patterns in the population. And that is one of the principal ideas behind this, is to try and get an idea of what it is that people in California are exposed to. And those data can be used by researchers, they can be used by public health officials. There are a variety of uses for this, but the idea was to just generate information that is, at this point, doesn't exist.
All right, thank you. Before we move on to the next portion of our agenda, excuse me, I just want to remind people that this is being webcast, and those of you that are watching the webcast, we will be going till 5 o'clock today. And if you have questions that you'd like us to share here at the meeting, you can email us at biomonitoring@ohha.ca.gov. And those of you that are in the public who are present today, also a reminder that we have the purple cards here for you to fill out, and we'll have opportunity for public comment after this next presentation. Thank you. Another reminder to our panel members and our staff. I'll do my best to identify the speaker, but if I forget, please identify yourself, because we are keeping record of who's providing comment at this meeting. So that's one reminder. And I believe our lead counsel has a suggestion for a reminder for panel members for this evening.
Right. I was told that you all are going to dinner this evening. Probably at least a quorum of the group would be together at dinner. And so I just wanted to remind you that it's important not to discuss the matters that are on the agenda or may come on the agenda for this panel when you're having. So if you can stay on different subjects. I know that's hard because the reason that you're together is because of this group, but it's best to avoid those discussions so that any discussions you do have can be made in a public forum.
All right, thanks for that reminder. Okay, Dr. Lipset, would you like to make the introductions for our next presenter? Thank you.
Our next presenters are the lab chiefs for this program for the Department of Public Health. Is Dr. Peter Flessel, who's the chief of the Environmental Health Laboratory branch. And just wanted to add a note about Dr. Flessel, that this will be his last panel meeting because he is retiring at the end of this month after many years of dedicated state service. And he will be accompanied in the presentation by Dr. Murto Petraeus, who is the the branch chief for the Environmental Chemistry Laboratory of the Department of Toxic Substances Control. Thank you.
Dr. Moreno, panel members, thank you very much. We're going to provide you with an update on laboratory capacity. I'll begin. Murto will take over. The content of today's presentation is largely derived from the conversations initiated by the conversations that we had after the last meeting, when several of you asked us questions about, well, what could you really do given the funding that exists right now? And so what we tried to do is to put together that would tell you about our current staffing and equipment progress, and then to ask some sort of soft questions about what we think we can do in what time frame and to what extent. So I'll start by bringing you an update on our scientists involved in the program. These are the 5 individuals
that are supported by the biomonitoring program from left to right. Pammy Benewald, Bob Ramage, Frank Barley, and John Winsher, who is here in the room. And Mimi Raffol, who is our admin person to support the staff, the laboratory staff. Those 4 individuals are the laboratorians. We are making real progress in getting our equipment. The upper left, the sample prep instrument that we'll use to automate and increase our throughput of samples. Upper right is an ICP-MS for metals testing. We're very happy to have that in place now. On the bottom is a manufacturer's photograph of high sensitivity LC tandem MS that we'll use for organics testing. This is currently in the box, and we're waiting for final renovations to the laboratory. The devil is in the details, that you know always, and it's at this point getting another 208 line to handle the power requirements. But we're almost there as far as our organic testing capacity, and we're definitely on our way as far as our metals testing capacity. So one question that we started to ask ourselves is, what is the number of samples that we could analyze with base funding, assuming minimal sample management? The numbers that I put up there are, under these conditions, maybe 1,000 whole blood samples, 1,000 serums, 1,000 urines. Now, the important caveat to sort of stop and explain is that minimal sample management means that we only log the samples, test them, and report them. That's very different than what we had set out to do in the full program. If you followed the full implementation rollout as it was planned, we actually had projected 4 PYs to do sample management, a research scientist and 2 senior lab assistants to actually do the hands-on work, and then an IT professional to essentially support the LIMS, the Laboratory Information Management System that we need to handle the samples. Think about what real sample management would involve if we're out there collecting the samples. If we're part of that, we have to provide the sampling materials. We have to make sure that everything that goes into the field has been quality controlled to avoid any contamination. We have to make sure that the labeling systems are appropriate for the field so that when it's back in, we can use those labels to enter the laboratory, into the samples into the laboratory. We can do the aliquoting of the samples and send them around to the various laboratories that are going to do the tests, and then we're going to create the archive. That's a lot of work. On the other hand, if we only receive, log, test, and report samples, we can handle a good bit more. What then, under these conditions of minimal sample management, could the public health laboratory do given the base funding that we have? This is our best case laboratory capacity estimate. These are the things that we might be able to do in the time frame that's shown on the slides here. So with regard to metals in whole blood, lead, cadmium, and mercury, we're actually there. And this is not something that we set out to do in terms of the biomonitoring program. We've been metals testing for a long time, so it was pretty easy for us to extend our metals testing to create a standard operating procedure that will really be in place in the next month or so. And once it's up, we feel we could run 1,000 samples a year. And then we've thought that arsenic would be an interesting addition to this metals panel, and we could do that. We could add arsenic to a panel probably by mid-spring, and once it's up and running, we could do 1,000 of these tests in whole blood per year. And then we could extend this metals work by choosing to look at speciated mercury or speciated arsenic, both reasonable metals of interest to Californians and ones that you really would like to speciate because of the differential toxicity of the various species. In another 10 or 11 months, we could probably be up in one of those speciation assays. And once having done that, we could probably turn around 400 samples per year. Again, assuming we didn't do any sample management. With simple, very minimal sample management. Now, what about the organic side of the public health laboratory? Remember, we're doing the non-persistent organics. Mertot is doing the persistent organics. So we're focusing on urine as the matrix for the most part. Granted, we're doing the metals in blood, but for the organics, we're looking at urine. Now, these are some examples of the tests that we might do. So we think that we'll be able to do two of the following with the resources, the laboratory resources and the equipment that we have. OP pesticides. We think we'll be ready to do that sometime in the late spring. Of course, having put this up there gives me a little bit of concern because every time we've made these slides, we've always, each time we do it, for one reason or another, we realize what's optimistic. But something like the late spring, we should be in a position to run the OP pesticides in urine. And in fact, I told you last time about the tracking study out in Tulare County. We're actually doing a little pilot study in support of the tracking program involving some, it's biodrift. The issue is how much of this stuff that's applied gets into people in the community around the fields. And so this was sort of dual use for biomonitoring and this tracking program activity. And so we got a jump start on that. And we hope that we'll be able to continue to do that. The other two options there are much more, they're softer opportunities. Namely, we haven't gone very far in developing methods for, on the one hand, phthalates and bisphenol A. It's possible, however, we've done enough thinking to know that we can do a phthalate panel and bisphenol A together in the same analysis. At least we believe we can. And that if we chose to do that and put effort into it, we could probably be ready to have a method in place by the fall, October '09. And once it's there as a standard procedure, we could run about 1,000 samples per year. Another alternative would be to look at the polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, a panel of those. Again, we could, if this was the choice of the program with your support, we could set up and have that panel ready to go sometime in the fall, probably October, November, maybe 1,000 samples per year. Assuming that we're not collecting the samples, we're not doing all that sample management. So now I'll let Mertot talk about activities in her lab.
Could I ask a clarifying question there? So with regard, for example, to the organics, if the panel were to suggest a different set of chemicals, let's say, the pyrethroids as another group of interest, would that be sort of doable instead of one of these on the same timeline?
It would have to be an either or, yes. Well,
right.
on the same
I was just sort of
timeline,
wondering if these were
approximately the same timeline. So we haven't done as much thinking about pyrethroids as we have about the phthalates, BPA, and PAH, and the OPs. Right. But we haven't gone very far into it. We've largely been focused on getting the instruments in, getting them installed, and then starting to collect a lot of the materials, the testing materials that could be used for basically any panel of organics.
So if you were to get sort of general direction from the panel about the sort of non-persistent organics in the near term, then that would allow you to sort of figure out which pathway to pursue in terms of your two groups of chemicals that you think that you'll be up and running with.
That's right. That's why it's really important to get input from the panel at this point, because we're really at that decision point.
I'll follow the same format as Peter, starting with our staff. These are our two staff. Judy Wang is a chemist on the left, and Dr. Miao Miao Wang, research scientist on the right. They're standing proudly in front of our new instrument. Now, unlike what Peter described for the public health laboratory, which got a whole section funded through the program, we only got these two staff, so we had to fold them into our existing staff because otherwise it wouldn't be viable. The staff need supervision, guidance, data review, quality assurance, and so forth. So by including them with the experienced staff acting as mentors, we can have something done. Now, the group that adopted these two new scientists is the quite experienced group that has been performing biomonitoring studies for many years. And we have a lot of experience doing chemicals, persistent chemicals, in many different matrices, from soils and sediments to biota, wildlife, human tissues, and so forth. This group is still active and will stay active in the area of emerging contaminants as it applies to many initiatives of DTSC. So it's busy with the DTSC programs, but provides the door, I guess, to start the new biomonitoring program. The existing staff are state staff and also contract staff funded by extramural grants from federal government. We have students that work in the lab, and we're also lucky to get a fellow, a postdoctoral fellow for free, funded by the Association of Public Health Laboratories. It's a one-year appointment, maybe expanded to second year, and we'll have this person. He started a month ago, and he started working on the serum method, so he can help to get us going in the beginning. We should note, however, that these are the two staff that we have. So, and whatever we promise that we can do or commit we can do, we have to keep in mind that it's limited. And if something goes wrong, we cannot even stay with the commitment. We need more staff, because without more staff, we can only probably do the things that I'll show you later, and not all these other interesting things I hear, or the chemicals that we'll be talking tomorrow. It's either or. So we cannot do the legislators or the RFI specimens, or we have to really choose what we can do. But I should say, because past history and the experience of our staff, any work that we do for DTSC can very well feed into this program. Even data we produce from our other studies can feed into this program. So there's synergy by having this new staff involved with our existing staff. Now our equipment, this is the high-resolution GCMS that was installed very recently, and as of Monday we start a one-week-long training. So this is the first piece of equipment that came. We're expecting also the liquid chromatograph LCMS that Peter showed. We expect also some of the sample preparation equipment that will help automate and increase our throughput. But things are not there yet, and we already are about 3 months behind schedule from what we thought we would be a few months ago. I just want to give you just some background on the other activities that we do in DTSC that will feed into the implementation of the biomonitoring program. Historically, we have been doing studies of persistent organic pollutants, or POPs, in all kinds of media, as I said, from soils and sediments to wildlife and human tissues. And we have built this capacity and capabilities over many years with trial and error, but we know where we stand if it comes to do organochlorine pesticides, OCPs, PCBs, and PBDs. So with the current methodology and the current technology, we can do about 500 samples of serum per year using a little over 2 staff, primarily contract staff doing the bulk of the work, but overseen by state staff who also do most of the instrumentation. We have good quality data, and we're confident about this area. Now, we're also expanding, adding more to our repertoire. So we add some of the new brominated flame retardants that can be extracted from the same serum. So we hope to expand our methods of that I'm listing there on the POPs to include these new brominated flame retardants. So we're making progress there, but we're not final yet. Now, we're very committed and doing a lot of work for DTSC using wildlife samples. Again, methods developed for the wildlife tissues or eggs or adipose or serum can be used usually for human tissues as well. So what we're doing for DTSC can again feed into the implementation of the program. And again, as I said, data that we produce for DTSC studies can be shared with the program and help expand. And last thing I have there is that we are modifying or revising our standard operating procedures that we have in our quality systems to conform with the Clinical Laboratory Improvement Amendments, CLIA requirements, which is something that whether we want to get certification for CLIA. So these are activities outside of the biomonitoring program, but would feed into the biomonitoring program. Now, the timetable I see here is that, as I said, the high-resolution GCMS is getting set up this month, and training will be this month. In February, we expect to set up and get training on the LCMS. And between January and April, we plan to set up and use the automated sample preparation equipment that will help us optimize and increase our throughput. Again, these are assumptions because we're not, in terms of timeline, because when things can go wrong, will go wrong. And parenthetical, I should say that all this equipment that we thought of getting, the sample preparation improvement and the LCMS and GCMS, are ideas we got from CDC. And they're used very productively. The difference, however, between CDC and us is in CDC, if one instrument fails, they go to the next one. They have banks of instruments, and they have a resident engineer to help repair their instruments. In our case, if something fails, we have to get authorization and approval, and it takes time and money, and it's not so easy. So if something can go wrong, we'll delay things. So our best estimate at this point, and also I have to say that we plan to send the staff for training at CDC. I guess both labs will send them when we're ready, sometime in the spring. So if we were to go and continue expanding on our POPs, our best estimate is in the spring, we'll have set up the new equipment, change our methodology to take advantage of the new automated equipment, with the goal to have a method that will allow us to develop, to have a capacity for 800 samples per year for these POPs by late fall. Again, this is an optimistic, and have been criticized by some of our staff saying that this may be promising too much, but that's a goal. So we have a goal and try to get there. So we need to get a decision pretty soon whether we're going to go with POPs or something else. So again, following Peter's example of a table, again, best case. As I said, we could possibly do about 800, start to be able to do 800 samples per year starting in October of the things that we are more familiar with, the PCBs, the PBDs, and the OCPs, and possibly some of the new brominated flame retardants. Or we can put our attention to the perfluorinated chemicals, use the LCMS. Apparently, these are more easy than the POPs. We haven't done them, so everything is difficult in the beginning. But probably we can be able to do about 1,000 samples per year by the spring, late fall. But we need to keep in mind that we cannot do both, so either the POPs or the perfluorinated. And it's not, we can never do both in October 09 or October 10 or ever, unless we get more staff. So the idea is we use a synergy of the entire group of the lab to get the program started, but at steady state we have 2 staff who should be there producing and generating data and getting new methods for new chemicals, and so that's a big limitation we have. And in summary, I guess representing both of our views here, is we made progress, the initial staff are on board, and the equipment are arriving, some of them are already here. Word of caution, repairs are costly and take time, and we have the new equipment have a 1-year warranty. After that, it will cost money. So again, we need operating expenses, we need staff, and that's why we try to work with external partners. Both labs will probably, the fellow that we have from the Association for Public Health Laboratories, so this will add hopefully 1 body to help with Peter's lab. Now, again, to reduce the time and the effort for sample management, we can go with the work some samples from the RFI, which come from one freezer to the next. And the idea, again, and the intent here is to be able to produce something as soon as possible so we keep the program alive and generate some good data. So with that, you can have questions.
Thank you for the presentations. Questions? We'll start on the right here. Dr. Luder.
Thank you both for the presentations. I have a question, which just a clarification, I guess. What I'm hearing is that the limit right now in terms of the number of samples that both of your labs, you expect to be able to analyze, in the time frames that you said, are more limited by staff than by the equipment, so that if you had more staff, both labs could potentially analyze more samples. Was I understanding that correctly?
Well, I would say it's, for us, it's probably, we're pretty much, it's neck and neck. So if you have more staff but you don't have the equipment, then you're in trouble too. So I would have to say that yes for her, no for us.
And then if I might, just one follow-up question. One of the things that you were talking about was that if equipment goes down, the expense of repairing it and not having a backup. And one thing I was was a little confused about the LCMS. Are there going to be two of them, one in each lab, or are you going to be using the same one? There are two, could one serve as a backup if there was a problem?
There will be one in each lab, and they will be dedicated to different types of chemicals.
Okay.
So even if they were in the same lab, you can't switch from one to the other easily.
Dr. Culver?
I'm concerned with the one-year warranty. Is it possible to get a maintenance contract?
Yes, but they're very expensive. It's about 10% of the value of the...
But should that be budgeted in?
Well, that's right.
You're staring into catastrophe.
That's right. Thank you very much. That's a very important point. So that's why we put it up there. The way it ought to be done is to have these what are called preventive maintenance contracts in place at the end of the warranty period. Because then you get on the phone, you get the guys out there almost instantaneously. Furthermore, you don't have the breakdowns that you're going to inevitably have because you're doing preventive maintenance. So the answer is yes, but as Myrto said, the costs are large. It's basically estimate around 10% of the capital cost. So we have, between the two of us, well over $1 million worth of laboratory equipment. So we're talking $150,000 for the preventive maintenance contracts, which we can't do at this point. So we're projecting short term.
Also, the plan was that
per year.
Yeah. That if the biomonitoring program is deployed over several years, in subsequent years we'll request money for preventative maintenance.
I'm just wondering, strategically, it would make more sense to do fewer samples and have higher reliability for the equipment. I don't know if that's possible. In other words, instead of doing 1,000 samples, do 800 and take the money saved. I don't know if it works that way, but I would think there's some critical trade-offs here. Because I know, I have people who run labs, and it's a disaster. Equipment's down because we just sit there for weeks until we get it fixed, and nothing gets done. So I'm just wondering if, given that there's some likelihood of the equipment failing anyway, and then instead of getting 1,000, you could only get 800. Why not assume that that's possible and then take that expected loss and use it as kind of an insurance policy?
Well, the 1,000 was the goal we had for when we're going to do the statewide survey. That was the goal, that we should be able to do 1,000 samples. So we try to see how can we get there.
Right. So that's not a tradable in terms of doing fewer samples but having higher equipment reliability?
For the time being, we're not having a statewide survey, so we have a smaller studies.
Community.
So we'll see how we go with that.
I would say, yes, Tom, you're right. It's like you have a car, you drive it 20,000 miles a year, you're probably going to turn it over and sell it sooner than if you drive it 5,000 miles a year. On the other hand, driving it's really important. With the instrumentation that we have, keeping it going is really important. So it is a trade-off. we were making estimates based on instruments up and running, performing well all the time. That's how we got those numbers. We could back off, probably will have to back off those numbers just because of the reality of running the operation. I don't know that you really want to manage a lab in which you say, now we're not going to do a lot of sample analysis this month because we want to save the instruments. I think we want to push them, and we want to push the sample prep, and we want to do as much throughput as we can and make sure that the samples that we're analyzing are important every step of the way.
We have questions on this down this side. Dr. Solomon and Dr. Bradman.
Yeah, thanks for those presentations. About some of the trade-offs among chemical groups, I was just have a few questions about that. One is, with regard to is there any possibility of picking subcategories of POPs? Say if the committee decided that we didn't care about the PCBs, but we cared about the flame retardants, would that still make it impossible to also look at perfluorinated chemicals because of that either or?
It's a very different technique. First of all, from beginning, it's a totally different sample. Right. The POPs, the way we have them, it's a multi-residue analysis. So in the same extract, we try to measure the pesticides, the PCBs, the PBDs, and probably others. If we drop the PCBs, it doesn't save us much because it's the same process. The quality assurance will be less, fewer standards, internal standards, but we don't save much. Now, the perfluorinated require a totally different extraction from the beginning. They're saying it's much easier than the POPs, but we haven't done them, so for us it will be difficult to start. But eventually it should be much simpler. POPs are the Cadillac, the very difficult, laborious, expensive. The others, anything else compared to the POPs is easier.
And in follow-up, there's some categories of chemicals or individual chemicals on the CDC list or that we're considering tomorrow as potential designated chemicals, and I'm not actually sure which of your labs they would fall under, the cyclosiloxane specifically, and also some of the phenols like triclosan. Would those fall sort of more in the persistent, Myrto, in your lab?
We looked at some siloxanes. We talked with people who've done them. They're easily found in environmental samples. We had some difficulty in blood to see them. The first time we tried them, maybe the levels were very low or it wasn't easy. But we have the standards and we're looking into those. Again, these are things that DTSC asks us to do, so we're doing them aside from the biomonitoring program. But once we have a method, if it's applicable, we can use it.
And how about the phenols? Like triclosan is basically a chlorinated phenyl ether, so it might be similar.
Pentachlorophenol, and we're doing some other hydroxylated metabolites, so they could be in that fraction, but we haven't looked for triclosan yet.
Okay. And presumably, if any of those categories of chemicals were included, that would be instead of either the POPs or the perfluorinated chemicals?
We would start the POPs, but then you have to separate, fractionate, and we use the organic fraction to do what we do, but we should do the other fraction to look at the more soluble, water-soluble ones. So that's, again, bifurcation and more steps.
Right. Thanks.
I just have a brief comment and then a comment related to Gina's question. One, for the OPs in urine, is that specific metabolites or non-specific or both?
Well, we're thinking about both. It's much easier the non-specific materials because you don't have to worry about getting the standards for all of the specific ones. But we're trying to take it using both approaches.
Okay. And then this next question is kind of almost a procedural question, and maybe perhaps more applicable for tomorrow. But we are tasked for putting together a list of designated chemicals and then priority chemicals. But should we be constrained by what the laboratory says they can do? I mean, it looks like you're in a startup phase. The list at CDC, the number of analyses is bigger than what than what we have right here, and then we may be adding on some other kinds of chemicals that are specific to California, and it seems to me there could be some tension between what we consider, a priority chemical, a designated chemical or priority chemical, and what the lab resources are. So I'm not sure how we are supposed to think about it if there are laboratory constraints, at least in the present. I mean, maybe in the future those will be solved.
Well,
I
there
don't know if
certainly are laboratory constraints.
Yeah.
The program wants your guidance. We're not. Mertot has a situation where she's doing things for her DTSC bosses, and so she's marching on those, independent of what the biomonitoring program suggests. But certainly for us, we want to hear, the program wants to hear from the panel about those chemical panels that you think are most important. And because we haven't gone that far. OPs, yes, we've spent some time there, and we're happy that we have it. The metals we've had, basically, in hand. But beyond that, we're really in the preliminary stages. So if you don't want phthalates and BPA, if you don't want PAH, and you really want something else, then you need to tell the program that.
If I could just make a comment in response to your question, this is Ed Moreno. My understanding is that the first charge of this panel is to recommendations for the designated list, and my understanding is that's what we do, regardless of the resources. We feel that this panel feels it's important that Californians be tested for the following list of chemicals, and that's the recommendation. But the second charge, it does, I believe, prioritizing does take into account several factors, including fundamentally, and this we're talking about here is resources. So among the designated list, here and now, what can we start with as priorities? But that designated list will serve as a designated list for years to come as we move, as resources become more available. Then we go back and look at the situation on a yearly basis, and we can start adding to the priority list. That's my understanding.
I guess also I have a procedural question, which again is, I understand that you have then methods developed and all of the quality control laboratory methods set up for these substances. And I guess the question is, we've been having these discussions about prior substances and that might be unique to California. At what point, looking at this calendar, do you need to know from this panel what those what we consider to be the priority chemicals, and how long, in some range, does it take to develop the methods and QC for those? Or, yeah.
It depends on how close to the chemicals we do now, the new chemicals are, whether they can be added to the method, or it's be completely different methodology.
Yeah, so I guess in the latter case, if we're in, sort of a, as you describe it, something is fairly different, what is the time frame?
That can be a year.
Yeah.
That's not unusual.
Right.
Especially when you're going at it for the first time.
Right.
But Michael, I hope you haven't misunderstood us.
Yeah.
We don't have these SOPs ready to go.
Okay.
The time frames that we proposed were for getting to the point where we could say to you, yes, bring me your sample. We can start today to do these tests. The nearest term for us is metals starting soon after the first of the year.
Right.
OPs maybe in late spring, and then October we're talking about some of those other organic panels. So yes, it's important that we have a good idea and that the panel and the program come to some consensus on that other issue. So we're talking about potentially designated chemicals tomorrow,
right.
But then at some point pretty soon we need to cut to the chase and say, oh, but these are the ones we as a team think we ought to actually be analyzing for with the limited resources that we have.
Right.
2 stories, though.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, I'd like to hand over to Dr. Denton.
Both of you talked in terms of 1,000 samples, 500 samples. How does that translate as far as individuals? If you have 1,000 samples, are those including are those duplicates, and so you're actually doing 500 individuals? What's the breakdown of samples versus individuals?
Right. I think that we talked a little bit about this earlier, but think about a participant. So, Joan, you're a participant. We're going to get from you several blood specimens for several analyses, and we're going to get a urine sample. So maybe 5 sample analyses per participant is maybe a multiplier. And no, when we're not thinking about the duplicate issue at all. We're just talking about if you're thinking about numbers of samples, you should remember that each participant will deliver more than one sample.
But for each panel of analysis, one participant will give one sample. So if we do bisphenol A in urine, it will be one sample from every participant. The same participant may give blood for POPs or siloxane or something different.
We're not getting the point. Say again. We'll listen carefully.
I think we're still confused. Okay, so back on your slide, you have an analysis of POPs or something for so many. Let's see, maybe you could. Okay, so for OP pesticides, 1,000 samples per year. What does that mean in terms of how many individuals will you be able to test for OP pesticides?
1,000.
1,000.
Sure.
So 1,000 different
urine
individuals.
specimens. You could be sampling. You could say, for instance, measure variations in a single individual over the course of time. So you might be looking at 100 people with 10 samples per person over time. But 1,000 samples means 1,000 urine specimens analyzed for OP pesticides.
So 1,000 different individuals, 1,000 times the same person.
If you like, yeah. 1,000 samples to run.
Okay, I have a question. I just want to make sure I got the numbers correct. I'm trying to keep tally of the number of samples that each lab can do and what was offered. It looks like the Department of Public Health lab can do 1,000 samples, which could mean 1,000 individuals, right? And then Department of Toxic Substance Control can do 800 to 1,000. And I'm sorry, estimates. Now, was there also an offer that we heard that the CDC had offered to do a number of samples?
That's in addition to everything that we've talked about.
Was that 500?
It's 500 for all 10 panels, and then it's 200 for a single chemical.
Right. That's a one-time commitment on their part, not an ongoing. This would be an ongoing capability.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Thank you. Other questions? Yes.
I'm trying to match what you're saying now with the lab capabilities and developing them over time, and then what we heard about earlier with looking at the RFI responses. And what I don't see on the criteria for RFI responses is looking at, I see analytes requested fit with lab capabilities, but not analytes fit with things that we may have chosen that we want you to develop capabilities in. Is that one of the things that may be, those may be one of the criteria? Does that make sense?
Well, I would just say I was delighted that good match between the RFI candidate chemicals and the ones that we had been thinking about. That was fortuitous, except for the pyrethroids.
Well, we had listed in the RFI which chemicals we can do, so the responders, I guess, had to match.
That's why it works so well.
I guess, but my question, yeah, my question is, if we develop a list tomorrow, will there be any relationship between the list we develop tomorrow and what you're capable of and what we might choose from the RFI?
Yeah, there are 3 levels of discussion there. There are a lot of discussions involving program and the panel and the laboratory capability that would drive that. So I don't think you can cut through it all that quickly.
Let's say we hope that there is a good correlation. If we drew a Venn diagram, that there would be substantial overlap.
At this time, I'd actually like to open it for public comment, and I think we'll still have a little bit of time for more panel discussion after public comment. I want the public to be able to share their opinion on what's been discussed on the second section of this afternoon's agenda. I still have Mr. Balt's request to speak, but are there additional requests? And before we move back to the panel, were there any emails received on this topic?
We received a comment from Diana Graham, who indicated her appreciation for the webcasting of this meeting.
All right, thank you. We appreciate you tuning in. Okay, Mr. Baltz.
Davis Baltz of Commonweal again. Thanks for the presentations. I'd just like to second what I heard from the it's the obligation or one of the duties of the panel to designate chemicals now that are of concern to California, and we would like to see biomonitored even if the resources don't exist now and maybe sometime in the future. It's important to sort of recognize that these are chemicals of concern for California and get them in the queue even if the queue is quite long. I don't know if we come to a point where we have to choose now in the short term between POPs and the perfluorinateds, that will be a tough decision. There does seem to be some market movement towards voluntary retirement of some PFC chemicals, so that might indicate that we should focus on the POPs, but that's going to be a thorny one. And then just the last thing, I also want to thank Peter Flessel for his years of service and wish you well in your retirement. Thanks.
All right, if there are no more comments from the public, I'll bring it back to the panel for another opportunity to discuss on this topic. Yes, Dr. Solomon.
Yes, I actually also want to thank Peter Flessel for everything, for doing so much over so many years, and for as well as for the presentation today. I'm actually trying to sort of wrap together our two discussions of this afternoon because it seemed like the panel felt pretty strongly that looking at maternal-child pairs is a good first step. And understanding also that this is an iterative process, so we'll be designating some chemicals tomorrow, presumably, or potentially, and then looking at maybe additional ones in the future, and similarly, sort of thinking about priority chemicals in an iterative way, but trying to get the ball rolling now. And so, in light of the fact that we're looking at kids and maternal, and fetal exposures, it seems to make some sense to think about as priorities chemicals that are, developmental neurotoxicants or endocrine disruptors that would be of particular concern in that population. And there are quite a few to choose from, probably too many when you put together the CDC list and the ones we're looking at tomorrow. But some of them have actually been quite well studied. And my particular bias is that, if a chemical or a group of chemicals has been pretty well studied in populations of mothers and children, especially here in California, that we may not want to repeat that. And so looking at ones that are newer or that haven't been as well studied would be appealing to me. And so, obviously there are quite a few metals that would be developmental neurotoxicants, but some of them, such as lead, have been quite well studied. And there are pesticides that are potential developmental neurotoxicants. Some have been quite well studied in some populations in California. Some of the endocrine disrupting chemicals, in contrast, maybe not quite as well studied in Californians yet, so might be an interesting direction to go. Thyroid disruptors such as the flame retardants, some of the estrogenic agents such as the phthalates and BPA, which were mentioned by Dr. Flessel, maybe some of the phenols, chlorinated phenols that are also potential thyroid disruptors would be of possible interest as if we're thinking about some priorities. Not to walk away from the metals, because I think there's still things to learn, certainly with mercury here in California, where I'm guessing we'd find some interesting things.
Could respond briefly to that, to your comment, Dr. Solomon. To the extent that we would be relying on, for the initial analysis, on the CDC laboratories, whatever would be done would, in that particular set of analyses, would be what's within their universe. But they offer to do 10 panels of studies, not 10 single chemicals. And so we're talking about substantial numbers of chemicals. You might, before we actually get to that point, we might want to review what their capabilities are and make some decisions based on that in relation to your discussions of designated chemicals and potential priority chemicals for California.
Dr. Wilson, did you have a comment?
You answered it actually, Michael. Clarifying this, what the CDC is going to do. Yeah. So, yeah.
I have comments. One, I also wanted to thank Peter for all the time that I've known you and worked together at different times. It's been a pleasure. And the other thing I just want to comment, just to underscore, laboratory issues are incredibly complex. And just kind of a reminder to all of us the challenges that the labs here face, just from personal experience and my own time measuring things and working with CDC and others. It seems like everything's a trade-off in terms of volume of material available, how you process it, making sure the QA/QC is good, having problems with one set of analyses but not with another, or having to make trade-offs with cost. You want to get, there's one chemical you really want to get, but it needs a whole separate extraction, a whole separate analysis, perhaps using new or different procedures that aren't compatible with other things, other analytes. So just to underscore, it's really it's a very challenging process to narrow down an analyte list and then actually to run them. So I guess I want to make sure that we appreciate that.
And yeah. Oh.
Hi, I have another comment from Miglena Wilbur from the Department of Pesticide Regulation, and her comment is, or question rather, is there a minimum time of California residence for survey participants? Want to answer that, Diana?
That isn't a topic that we've discussed at this point.
Okay. Thank you. Dr. Alexeyev.
Yeah, George Alexeyev. I wanted to ask a question to, actually to Flessel and Petraeus, in commenting on what Dr. Solomon was saying on the time issue. And I know you gave some times in these presentations, and I'm wondering if the timing is, if you were thinking of the time, is that if we told you today, do this particular chemical, it would take you that amount of time to get up to speed, because as Dr. Solomon pointed out earlier, there's a requirement of prioritizing the chemicals that are designated. So I'm just wondering if we had a meeting in January or February where we discussed prioritizing chemicals and designated, helped the, made a decision, perfluorinated or POPs or whatever, would you still have the time to, would these times still be fairly relevant, or would that be pushing you back 2 months or something like that?
Right.
Well, luckily or unluckily, our instrument is not here yet, so January that won't make much difference. Soon after that, we need to know. And again, some things will be easy to do, and the only estimates we made is for the POPs because we have a good handle on them, and the perfluorinated because we heard it's simpler. If you give us a third option, we have to start calculating from beginning, and things may be not so good.
I would say from my perspective, those estimates are really soft. I mean, there are a lot of things that can stretch them out. So if you told us in January, February, you wanted to say to work on that PAH panel, we could probably bring it in by the end of the year. But still, I mean, 9 months is the same as 12 months shooting from here.
And I was wondering also with regard to the CDC analysis, if there was a timing issue on that.
Not from the standpoint of methods development, because whatever they have listed on their panels of analytes, they already have methods for it. They're already doing these kinds of analyses for the NHANES group.
Underscore, though, with CDC, there's always a time factor in terms of getting your results back.
Yeah, that's a different question.
Any other questions from Pat? I'm sorry. Oh, go ahead.
Michael, I have a go back. I remember at our last panel meeting that the individual from CDC said that the 2,000 statewide samples were plenty for doing the statewide survey. If we look at the amount of samples that can be done, including the CDC, it seems like we could have anywhere from 1,200 to 1,500 individuals that could be represented in what we have available now. Why is that not then adequate to do a statewide survey?
Well, it would depend on what you would want to get out of a statewide survey. If you wanted to do the kind of random sample, a probability-based survey that we talked about before, that aspect of it is very expensive and time-consuming, and we don't have the resources to do that at this point. And I don't think that we would be as likely to get foundation funding to be able to do something like that, at least based on my looking at a variety of different foundation websites and the kinds of things that they seem to be interested in, which is more community-based, community-focused types of studies. But the numbers of staff that would be needed to do that we would have to hire under contract would be much, much, much greater than what we would have to do with one of these, a community type of study. And in addition, in terms of trying to get a representative sample then of, say, theoretically we could do something like that given adequate resources, but the numbers of staff that would be required are just not something that we think would be feasible to do at this point.
So it's not the analytical laboratory capability that is the issue for the statewide sampling at this point in time. It's more the contract staff or the state staff that would be needed to design a survey, conduct the survey, get the samples. Is that the portion that makes statewide sampling at this point in time not feasible?
Well, it's partly that. It's also it's the time dimension that's involved in it. Like the Canadian government last year and this year is doing a national biomonitoring survey similar to what NHANES does. They began planning for that, I think it was around 2001, and they went out into the field 6 years later. This is what we had been planning to do with the statewide survey as well, that it would take a number of years to roll out. And if we're really interested in doing, undertaking some activities that would generate some results earlier, I think that undertaking these community studies would be a better way to go at this point, and more realistic just in terms of the likelihood of getting external funding for them as well.
Joan, I wanted to add a footnote to what Michael just said. the point that I wanted to make is that these numbers were assuming that we really didn't do any of that sample management that really is labor intensive. This is just if we put our ears back and do samples. You bring me the samples, you put them down, I log them in, I analyze them, and I send you the results on an Excel spreadsheet. So when I showed these slides, when I shared these slides with a wise colleague, he said, "You know what they're going to think? As soon as you put their up there, they'll think that, well, look, we can do the statewide study with these kinds of numbers, right?" So, right, it's not quite that true. We wanted to. You're right, though. You're on to the point that the analytic capacity is there, but there's a lot you have to build around it to make it work.
I know we've been having these discussions about potential designated chemicals, and you've been participating in that. It's been really valuable. And I guess first a question, and that is if do you feel that your understanding of sort of the state of the art of analytical methods for biomonitoring samples is such that in Rose discussion over these designated chemicals that you might be able to give us a sense of specifically what the laboratory challenge is going to be and the potential time frame in developing the methods to assess assess these. That's the first, and then the second is thank you, Peter, for everything, for helping get this off the ground and move it forward. I think we all so appreciate what you've done. So,
thank you, Michael. I would just say that, as you know, since you've been part of the work group that's been thinking about the potentially designated chemicals, there's been a lab component to that discussion, and so we've been thinking about the feasibility of doing the analysis. We haven't been thinking about it that critically, so to be able to tell you tomorrow, well, is that going to be 12 months, or is that a year and a half, or is that 8 months? I don't think so. But we can certainly sort of broad outline say, yeah, that's feasible or that's not feasible. The time frame is a little harder to put a finger on.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Well, I'm going to go out on a limb here a little bit with regard to the CDC chemicals, because I was just, after our discussion about their willingness to look at 10 categories, and I looked through what they can do, and they can do about 20 categories, and so presumably we have to pick, half of these as ones that we might want to consider, not necessarily even as priority chemicals, but ones that we would want to consider for this sort of community study that we would do. And it seems like there could be, I don't know what other what other panel members might think, but it seems worth looking at the metals in parts of interest in mercury and fish consumption in California and how that might be relevant. And I think the phthalates are of broad interest, especially in a population of infants and fetuses. The specific OP metabolites would also be of interest in this group. And I think the pyrethroids as well, just because of how widespread they're becoming for household use. The environmental phenols include bisphenol A and also triclosan, so some important consumer product-related exposures. PBDEs, obviously very interesting in California because we're curious whether they're declining. We hope to see that. And even if we can't ourselves do the perfluorinated chemicals, I think it would be great to ask CDC to do it. Perchlorate, obviously, is of enormous interest in California, though if we're, depending on where the population lives, that might or might not show much, though there's clearly dietary exposures. And then that would be 8 categories, and we'd still have room for a couple more. And the couple more could include various things. I think cotinine would be extremely interesting because I'm guessing that the levels would be pretty low, and I think that's an important thing to document from a public health perspective. And other possibilities would be another category of pesticides or potentially the VOCs. But it's just my 2 cents and where I might go if I were sort of checking my way down the CDC list and putting together a proposal for funding on this.
Yeah, I think that the panel will have an opportunity in the future to weigh on this. I mean, if you want to discuss this now, that's fine, but I think that we need to get further along in terms of having a study design, talking with CDC, trying to get something set up. And that's not going to happen in the next month or two. You'll have another opportunity to talk about this at greater length if you like.
This is Edmund, and I think what I'm hearing from Dr. Solomon and others probably are feeling the same way, is that we're getting enough information now. We need more information, but we're getting enough information now that some of us are thinking already about prioritizing. We do need to get through the designation portion first, I believe, and that's what's on the agenda for tomorrow. But I was, what I'm thinking is that perhaps tomorrow, that's towards the end of the meeting, perhaps we can have the panel and the program staff can begin to have some discussion about planning for the agenda for the next meeting to make sure that that agenda will meet the needs of the panel members and meet the needs of the laboratories to try to begin to focus their direction and their efforts and get us as soon as possible to where we need to be to program. So those are my thoughts, and if that's, I think that would that be reasonable to include in tomorrow's discussion?
Dr. Moreno, in the afternoon there is the next steps piece on chemical selection. I think it would fit nicely into that place on the agenda. We had been planning to have that discussion then. And I guess the other thing is we haven't, I think the statute is flexible enough that, as others have mentioned, that the designated chemical pool can change over time and the priority chemical pool can change over time. And I think from what I've heard from some of the comments around the CDC 500 study is that really is kind of a feasibility study and thinking ahead about what might be priority chemicals. So maybe not for the first batch, but maybe for future batches.
All right, with that, if there are no comments from panel members, okay, I'm going to go ahead and ask that Dr. George Alexieff give some, or summarize what was just discussed today and close this meeting, or allow us to, I guess it'll be recessed till tomorrow. So, Dr. Alexieff.
Well, today we had essentially 3 presentations, one from Dr. Lipset, one from Dr. Flessel, and one from Dr. Petraeus. In terms of Dr. Lipset gave an overview of the current status of the program and the resource needs and the current resource status, and which sort of focused the discussion on what could be accomplished with the current funding level that we have. In the discussion of the laboratory capacity, and I think it's important to point out, Dr. Lipset discussed the 2 types of studies that we were looking at to address with regards to the current capacity of funding. One was this RFI study and the goals with regard to that, and they have put out an RFI. They've received some interest in that. They will be reviewing it and providing some comments back in January, either at the next meeting or probably through some public medium about what the results of that analysis was. In addition to that, there was discussion of community-based studies, and in particular, there was a list of possible types of studies that could be conducted from a community standpoint. And there was a sort of a sense of the committee given to the staff here that community studies would be very meaningful with regards to if they're reflective of the larger population. And I would think that also Dr. McCone sort of just mentioned this as well, but more and more of a statistical kind of point to try to look at the study design, such as be as reflective as possible of the population at large. There was a discussion of whether or not this type of community study should be hypothesis or descriptive driven, and descriptive driven seemed to be the focus. Primarily hypothesis driven studies are pretty much more focused on research, and this would be more helpful for the types of things we're looking at. In particular, one particular design was this maternal child sort of component linking, which could be very helpful for our understanding of some chemicals. Let's see if there's anything else. And with regards to laboratory, we had a lot of discussion about the types of chemicals that could be analyzed in the timelines, and there was, depending upon the laboratory, somewhere between 500 and 1,000 samples that could be analyzed per year, but that additional funding would be needed if there was a lot of management required of the sampling. And I would say that's it for now.
All right. Well, thank you. Let's see. Well, with that, I also want, before we recess, I think we're not adjourning today. We're recessing till 9 o'clock tomorrow morning. Is that correct? This is an ongoing meeting. Before we recess, I do want to also thank Dr. Fly. So I haven't had a chance to work with you other than my capacity as the chair of this distinguished panel. And your insightfulness and your honesty has allowed this panel, I believe, to quickly move through the difficulties that you face in a way that we understand it, and is very helpful. So thank you.